This is the story of the woman who invented one of Japan's most famous art forms and was banned from performing in it within a single generation. Kabuki theater has been performed almost entirely by men for roughly 400 years now, and almost none of the men who eventually came to define it had anything to do with how it actually started. Almost nothing about Izumo no Okuni's life is certain, and that's itself part of the story. Historians place her birth around 1578, somewhere near Izumo province on Japan's western coast, the daughter of a blacksmith who worked at the Izumo Grand Shrine. She eventually served there herself as a miko, a shrine maiden, a role that combined ritual duties with sacred dance. That much is generally accepted by most historians who've written about her. Everything after it gets blurrier, and even the basic fact of when she died is disputed, with different sources placing it anywhere from 1610 to as late as 1640, a 30-year spread for the death date of someone credited with founding an entire national art form. A woman now credited as the founder of Kabuki, one of the most recognizable Japanese art forms in the world, left behind almost no reliable paper trail of her own. What she did leave behind is a documented turning point. Sometime around 1603, on the dry riverbed of the Kamo River in Kyoto, the very same year Tokugawa Ieyasu had himself formally proclaimed shogun and kicked off the 2.5 centuries of rule that would define the Edo period. Japan's most famous theatrical tradition, and the government that would spend decades trying to control it, were born in the same 12 months, on opposite ends of the social order. The location matters as much as the date. This wasn't a temple stage or a noble household's private theater. It was waste ground, the kind of open public space where traveling performers set up because nobody owned it and nobody could charge admission for it. Okuni had been performing Nembutsu Odori, a Buddhist dance traditionally used to invoke the name of Amida Buddha, a devotional practice meant to carry the dancer and the audience toward enlightenment. By the time she got hold of it, that dance had already drifted from religious observance into popular folk entertainment across Japan. And her version pushed it further still, turning a prayer dance into something sultry and charged with sexual innuendo, mixed in with comedic sketches about men sneaking off to meet prostitutes at tea houses and public bathhouses. She took a sacred form and used it to stage parodies of exactly the kind of behavior religious authorities were supposed to discourage. Off stage, she dressed the part of someone daring you to look away. Accounts describe her in Portuguese-style trousers and a foreign hat, a gold sword at her hip, and a crystal rosary hung with a gold crucifix. None of this reflected any actual religious conversion. Japan's relationship with Christianity in this period was already complicated and increasingly hostile, with the early stages of the suppression that would eventually end in mass persecution already underway in parts of the country. Wearing a crucifix as jewelry while parodying sex workers on a riverbed wasn't faith, it was costume, a deliberate borrowing of the single most provocative foreign symbol she had access to, worn for the same reason a kabuki mono, an eccentric or deviant of the era, might dress the part. With a full century of warfare finally grinding to a halt, a real subculture of these kabuki mono had sprung up around Japan's cities. Men in foppish, exaggerated fashions, carrying swords so long and ostentatious they'd have been useless in an actual fight, sporting outlandish hairstyles that had nothing to do with practical battlefield grooming anymore. They got drunk, brawled in taverns, and pulled cross-dressing pranks specifically designed to scandalize anyone watching. Okuni's entire stage persona borrowed directly from that real, contemporary subculture rather than inventing its aesthetic out of nothing. The point, for her just as much as for them, was to be looked at. Her single most famous routine made that theatricality explicit. Okuni built a piece around Nagoya Sanzaburo, a samurai who died in 1603, the same year her riverbed performances are usually dated to. In the act, her voice and her dancing call his spirit back from the dead so he can dance with her one more time. Whether the two of them had actually been involved while he was alive, or whether she built the entire relationship out of nothing more than a name and a date, isn't something the historical record settles. It didn't need to be true to work. A ghost stepping out of the audience to dance with the woman who'd summoned him back was a sensation either way, blending romance, the supernatural, and a kind of meta-theatrical trick that blurred the line between the performance and the world watching it. To understand just how radical that riverbed act was, it helps to know what Japanese theater already looked like in 1603. No, the established, government-patronized tradition had been refined for more than 2 centuries under Ashikaga Shogunate sponsorship by the time Okuni started dancing. No actors were always male, always masked, performing on a fixed 3-sided stage in front of a stylized painted pine tree, accompanied by a small ensemble of traditional instruments in a deliberately slow, ritualized style descended directly from religious performance. It was respected, it was elite, and it was almost completely closed to anyone without the right patronage or pedigree. Its most celebrated playwright, Ziemi, had been brought into that world as a child through the personal patronage of a shogun, his entire career and education a gift handed down from the very top of the social order. Okuni's act took the opposite position on every single one of those points. No masks, since the whole point was that audiences could see exactly who was performing. No fixed elite venue, just open public ground. No religious solemnity, just a sacred dance repurposed into comedy and innuendo. Where no asked an audience to sit still and decode symbolic stillness, Okuni gave them sex jokes, a resurrected ghost, and a woman in a stolen crucifix. Kabuki wasn't simply a new style sitting next to No, it was built, point for point, as No's inversion. The name that stuck to all of this didn't come from Okuni herself, it came from how audiences and critics described what she was doing. The word kabuki traces back to kabuku, meaning to lean, to tilt, to deviate from what's expected, and to the kabuki mono, the flamboyantly dressed deviants of the era who dressed and behaved the way Okuni performed. There's also a less flattering layer underneath it, a homophone that could just as easily be read as referring to song, dance, and prostitution all at once, since Okuni's troupe was made up entirely of women, many of them recruited from backgrounds in sex work, performing material built around brothels and trysts. The pun worked precisely because both readings were true at the same time. People called her style kabuki because it was eccentric and because it was disreputable, and for more than 2 centuries afterward, the art form she founded carried that second meaning embedded right in its own name, not formally replaced by a more respectable homophone meaning skill until sometime in the 1800s. None of that disreputable framing stopped it from spreading. Within a remarkably short time, Okuni's style had moved well beyond a single riverbed in Kyoto. She performed at Kitano Shrine. She's even recorded as having performed before the imperial court for noblewomen, the same aristocratic world that supposedly looked down on commoner entertainment, drawn in anyway by something genuinely new. Other troupes began copying her format almost immediately, and within a few years, kabuki had become a recognizable, commercially viable form of entertainment across multiple cities, built entirely on a template one woman had improvised out of a sacred dance, a ghost story, and a wardrobe full of foreign novelty items. The backlash arrived almost as fast as the popularity did, and for reasons the authorities were fairly upfront about. Performances by Okuni's troupe and the women who imitated her became flashpoints for exactly the kind of disorder a peacetime government had no patience for. Men competed for the attention of individual performers, sometimes violently, and there was a widely held suspicion, not entirely unfounded given who many of the performers were, that the dancing on stage doubled as advertising for services available afterward. The theater wasn't just associated with prostitution by an unfortunate homophone. In practice, for at least some performers, it actually functioned as one. The timing of that backlash lines up with a government tightening its grip on nearly every form of public behavior during exactly these decades. The same Tokugawa regime cracking down on disorderly kabuki crowds was simultaneously issuing strict codes of conduct for the samurai class, regulating who could marry whom across domain lines, and ramping up the persecution of Christianity into the policy of near-total national seclusion that would lock Japan away from the outside world for 2 centuries. An unlicensed, commoner-driven spectacle that drew mixed crowds, encouraged rivalry and disorder, and made stars out of women with no aristocratic pedigree at all, was never going to be left alone for long by a government busy tightening control over every other corner of Japanese life. In 1629, the shogunate under Tokugawa Iemitsu banned women from performing kabuki outright. The official justification leaned on moral reform and public order, the same fights and scandals that had been building for years, finally giving the government enough cover to act. It's worth sitting with what that band actually did. An entire art form invented by a woman, built on an all-female cast, performing material that drew its energy specifically from women playing both the romantic leads and the comic relief, got handed over entirely to men within roughly a quarter-century of its invention. Okuni may not have lived to see the form she built become legally impossible for someone like her to take part in, depending on which of the disputed death dates you believe, though it's entirely possible she did. What happened next reveals just how little the actual moral concern was about gender, and how much it was about controlling sex work specifically. With women barred from the stage, theaters started casting wakashu, adolescent boys, in female roles instead, on the theory that removing women from the equation would remove the problem. It didn't. This wakashu kabuki phase lasted barely 2 decades, from 1629 to 1652, before the same complaints about offstage solicitation and exploitation forced the shogunate to ban boy performers too. After 1652, the rules narrowed a third time, restricting kabuki roles, female and male alike, to adult men only. That's the origin of the onagata, the male performer who specializes in female roles. A tradition so thoroughly established by the time it solidified that later generations would treat it as kabuki's natural, essential form, rather than what it actually was. The third attempted fix in under 50 years for a problem the government had first tried to solve by simply removing the gender of the person who'd invented the entire art form. The irony compounds from there. Within a few generations, kabuki had become exactly the kind of codified, prestige-laden tradition that gets treated as timelessly, essentially Japanese. The kind of theater foreign visitors get taken to see as proof of an unbroken cultural lineage. Actors built dynastic lineages passed from father to adopted son for centuries. Family names carrying enough weight that audiences would judge a performance partly on how well a son lived up to his father's reputation in the same role. Print culture exploded around them. Woodblock artists developing an entire stylized technique just for rendering actors' faces accurately enough that fans could recognize their favorites at a glance. Portraits of leading men selling by the thousands. Fan culture and celebrity gossip organized entirely around male performers playing roles a woman had invented for herself. The stylized makeup, the elaborate costuming, the runway stage cutting through the audience, all of it built up around performers who were, by design, not the kind of person who started it. Okuni's actual contribution gets a respectful footnote in most histories of the art form she's credited with founding, while the centuries of male performers who came after her get the lineages, the fan bases, and the woodblock prints. The irony reached its sharpest point in exactly the area Okuni had once made her own. Onagata, the men who specialized in playing women, didn't just perform femininity on stage. Within a few generations, they'd become the recognized authorities on it off stage too, advising real women on how to properly apply makeup, arrange their hair, and hold a fan. Fashionable women across Japan started copying hairstyles popularized by these male performers, an upswept style called shimada that spread through the idol culture surrounding kabuki's leading men. Even though the style had often started life as a wig on a man's head rather than a real woman's actual hair. A woman had built the art form. Men who replaced her ended up lecturing women on how to be women, and those lectures sold. She herself simply vanishes from the record at some point after 1610, when most accounts place her retirement. There's no death notice anyone agrees on, no gravesite treated as definitively hers, no later writings or interviews, nothing. The closest thing to a primary source on what she actually looked like in motion is a single surviving folding screen painting from the early 1600s, an Okuni Kabuki Byobu showing her mid-performance. It's essentially the only direct visual evidence of the woman who started all of this. And even that survives, more by accident than by any deliberate effort to preserve her memory. A woman whose single afternoon on a dry riverbed in Kyoto eventually produced one of the most recognizable theatrical traditions on Earth, disappears from history with less documentation than the samurai, whose ghost she once summoned for a crowd. We actually know more about Nagoya Sanzaburo, a man who only matters to this story because Okuni decided to dance with his memory, than we know about what happened to Okuni herself. There's a version of the story that frames it as simple, uncomplicated progress, a disreputable street performance gradually refined and elevated into a respected national art form. That framing requires leaving out who got pushed out of the building during the renovation. Every step that made Kabuki more legally tolerable, banning women, then restricting boys, then settling on adult men exclusively, was a step that removed the kind of people Okuni actually was, and the kind of people her original troupe actually employed, from the art form they'd built. What survived wasn't a refinement of her vision so much as a replacement of it, performed for centuries afterward by exactly the demographic that had no part in inventing it in the first place. The pun in the name held for 200 years specifically because nobody in charge particularly wanted to clean up the part of Kabuki's origin that the more comfortable meaning of the word was quietly covering for. What we're left with is a strange kind of founding myth, an art form built by a shrine maiden's daughter in foreign trousers and a stolen crucifix, summoning a dead man's ghost on a riverbed nobody owned, immediately copied, immediately commercialized, and within 30 years legally redefined to exclude anyone who looked like her. Kabuki today is performed almost entirely by men in a tradition that prizes continuity and lineage above nearly everything else. The woman at the start of that lineage left no descendants in the art form bearing her name, no school, no style passed down in her honor, nothing but a disputed birth year, a disputed death year, and a pun that took 2 centuries to stop meaning exactly what everyone at the time understood it to mean.